Imagine looking at a map of the world at the height of the British Empire. On almost every continent, there were territories marked with the same color: India, Canada, Australia, Egypt, South Africa, Caribbean, Middle East. It was as if a small island in the Atlantic had managed to extend its arms across the entire planet. But there is a question that makes this story even more impressive. How did a relatively small nation manage to build the largest empire the world had ever known? Great Britain did not have the largest population on the planet. It did not have the largest territory, and for much of its history, it was surrounded by great European powers. Even so, its ships crossed oceans. Its merchants reached distant places, and its soldiers took part in conflicts in practically every corner of the world. At the height of its expansion, the British Empire controlled territories, inhabited by hundreds of millions of people, and encompassed an enormous share of the planet's land. But this did not happen overnight. The empire was built over centuries, and the first piece of this gigantic machine was not an invincible army. It was something apparently much simpler: the sea. To understand British power, we need to go back to the period when Europe was beginning to compete for the world's trade routes. Portugal and Spain had opened maritime routes to Asia and the Americas. The Netherlands and France also began building their own commercial networks. England quickly realized that the future would not be decided only on land. It would be decided in the oceans. Trading. Companies began establishing outposts and colonies in strategic regions. One of the most important was the East India Company, which initially was not a traditional imperial army, but a trading company. It bought, sold, negotiated, and established a presence in extremely profitable regions. And here begins one of the most surprising parts of this story. Great Britain discovered that it did not necessarily need to conquer everything directly. In many places, it could first trade, establish alliances, control ports, and build influence. Then, when an opportunity arose, that influence could be transformed into political domination. It was a much more complex strategy than simply sending soldiers to conquer territories. While other empires sought to control large areas of land, the British began building a kind of worldwide network: ports, trade routes, naval bases, colonies, companies, and alliances, each point connected to the other. But one thing was still missing: a force capable of protecting this gigantic network. And it was precisely at this moment that Great Britain began developing its greatest strategic advantage: a navy capable of turning the ocean into a British highway. And when this naval force began to grow, the world's balance of power began to change. For centuries, a nation's power depended mainly on its armies, but the British understood something fundamental. Whoever controlled the oceans could control the trade that crossed the oceans. The Royal Navy progressively became one of the most powerful naval forces on the planet. Its ships protected trade routes, escorted goods, and could appear in regions extremely far from British territory, and this created an extraordinary advantage. Great Britain could fight far from home. An enemy army attacking England had to cross the English Channel. But the British Navy could travel thousands of kilometers to protect commercial and strategic interests. This difference completely changed the game. Imagine a British merchant sending goods from India to Europe. He needed to cross thousands of kilometers of ocean. If the route were controlled by a rival power, the entire trading system would be threatened. Therefore, the British began to see certain points on the planet as strategic pieces: Gibraltar, Malta, the Cape of Good Hope, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong. These places were not important only because of their territories. They were important because they allowed maritime routes to be controlled or supplied. The logic was simple: control the right points and you can influence enormous distances. But naval power alone does not explain everything. Great Britain also possessed another extraordinary advantage: money. London became one of the world's great financial centers. Banks, insurance, Investments and companies helped finance trade and expansion, and there was a powerful connection between trade, industry, and military power. The greater the trade, the greater the wealth. The greater the wealth, the greater the ability to finance ships and soldiers, the greater the military strength, the greater the ability to protect trade. And the more protected trade was, the greater the opportunities to become wealthy again. It was a cycle. Trade generated wealth, wealth financed power, power protected trade. But then something happened that would accelerate this process like never before. The Industrial Revolution. Great Britain pioneered modern industrialization, machines, factories, coal, iron, and new forms of production transformed its economy. Now, the island was not only a commercial power, it was also becoming an industrial power, and that meant producing more quickly. Ships, weapons, machines, textiles, railways, equipment. British industry began feeding the imperial system, but there was an even greater consequence. Industrial production needed raw materials and consumer markets, and the empire offered both. Some colonies supplied raw materials, others served as markets. Ports connected these regions. Ships transported goods. Banks financed the operations, and the navy protected the routes. Great Britain was building something much larger than a collection of colonies. It was building a global system, but this system would face its greatest test precisely in the place that would become one of the most important jewels of the empire. India. In the popular imagination, many people imagine that Great Britain simply arrived in India with a huge army and conquered the entire territory. The reality was much more complex. When the British began expanding their influence, India was not a unified country as we know it today. There were different kingdoms, regional powers, alliances and conflicts, and the British knew how to exploit these divisions. The East India Company became an extremely powerful force. It traded, administered territories, and maintained military forces. In certain situations, it formed alliances with local rulers. In others, it went to war. Little by little, its influence grew. And this reveals a fundamental characteristic of British expansion. The empire often advanced by using a combination of trade, diplomacy, alliances, and military force. It was not just a matter of conquering, it was a matter of controlling ports, controlling routes, controlling resources, controlling financial centers, controlling strategic points, and when necessary, controlling governments. But the system also depended on local soldiers. Thousands of Indians served in military forces associated with British rule. This allowed Great Britain to exert influence over a gigantic region without having to send its entire population to fight. And then, in 1857, one of the greatest crises of British rule in India took place. The Indian Rebellion placed the system under enormous pressure. The revolt was brutal and left deep scars. After it, the British government took direct control of India, replacing the company's rule. India became a central piece of the British Empire, and its importance was enormous. Population, resources, trade, geographical position, military strength. All of this transformed the territory into one of the fundamental bases of British power. But while India was strengthening the empire, another revolution was taking place. The speed of the world was changing. Railways began connecting distant regions. Telegraphs made it possible to transmit messages at speeds that previous generations could never have imagined. Steamships reduced the time needed to cross oceans. And all of this favored a power that already possessed a worldwide network. Now London could receive information from extremely distant territories in much less time. Orders could travel, goods could travel, soldiers could travel, money could travel. The empire was beginning to function almost like a global nervous system. And there is an even more impressive detail. Great Britain did not necessarily need to occupy every inch of territory to exert influence. In many places, it was enough to control ports, trade routes and strategic points. This allowed a relatively small nation to exert influence far greater than its size suggested. At the end of the 19th century, the expression, "the empire on which the sun never sets," made sense. When the sun was disappearing in one part of the empire, it was still shining in another. But no empire grows forever, and precisely when British power seemed almost impossible to challenge, new powers began to emerge. Germany, United States, Japan, and, above all, a change that no one could ignore. The wars of the 20th century were about to completely transform the global balance of power. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire seemed practically indestructible. Its flag was spread across enormous areas of the planet. Its navy was powerful. London was one of the great financial centers of the world, and British trade connected entire continents. But there was a problem. Maintaining a gigantic empire was expensive, and then came the First World War. Great Britain managed to survive and, in certain respects, even expand its territories after the defeat of the Central Powers. But the cost was enormous. Millions of people were mobilized, economies were strained, debts grew, and the old European order began to collapse. Then came something even more devastating. The Second World War. Great Britain once again faced an existential threat, this time against Nazi Germany. British resistance prevented Hitler from eliminating Great Britain from the war, but victory came at a gigantic price. The British economy was deeply weakened, and meanwhile, two new superpowers were emerging: United States and Soviet Union. The world was entering a new era. Maintaining a global empire was no longer as simple as before, and then the processes of decolonization began. India gained its independence in 1947. Other territories followed similar paths in the following decades. Colony after colony began to become independent. The British flag was removed from places where it had remained for generations. The empire began to disappear. But here is the most important point. The British Empire did not become the largest empire in history because of a single advantage. It was the combination of several: a favorable geographical position, a powerful navy, international trade, finance, industrialization, technology, diplomacy, trading companies, strategic bases, alliances, and military capability. Everything worked together. Great Britain built a network in which each part strengthened the others. Trade financed expansion. Expansion created new markets. Markets fueled industry. Industry strengthened military power. The navy protected the routes, and the routes kept trade functioning. It was a gigantic cycle, and perhaps this is the true answer to the question: why did Great Britain rule the largest empire in history? Not because it was simply the most powerful nation in every respect, but because it managed to transform naval power, trade, money, industry, strategy, and geography into a single global system. At its peak, the British Empire came to control approximately a quarter of the planet's land and govern hundreds of millions of people. But no empire is eternal. The same system that made Great Britain powerful eventually faced a world where maintaining colonies became increasingly difficult, expensive, and politically unsustainable. The empire disappeared, but its influence did not disappear completely. English became one of the most important languages on the planet. London remained a global financial center. Legal systems, institutions, railways, borders, and political structures, created during the imperial period, continued to influence many countries. And perhaps this is the most fascinating part of this entire story. The largest empire in history disappeared as an empire, but left marks that can still be found in the modern world. The flag changed, the borders changed, the governments changed. But the influence built over centuries remains present, and it all began with a small island that decided to look out at the ocean and ask, What if the entire world could be connected to us? That was how an island power built one of the greatest political, economic and military machines the world has ever known. The British Empire.